to this webinar on getting ready for research ethics and research integrity in Horizon 2020. I'm very happy that over 300 participants from many different countries have registered to this webinar, and I see 170 are online now. And yeah, there seems to be a huge interest in this area, but maybe also a need for further clarifications. Therefore, I will only say a few introductory words in order to leave enough time for the expert from the European Commission to explain the process and the details of the ethics appraisal procedure in Horizon 2020. I have to check how I get to the next slide, sorry.
If you leave the cursor on the screen and then just press down for the next presentation. Just press on the...
No. Yeah, sorry. Now it worked. Okay, let me tell you a few words about FFG. The Austrian Research Promotion Agency, FFG, is the largest national funding agency for applied research in Austria. Next to our national funding programs, we are also responsible for giving advice to researchers in order to take part in European and international programs. The FFG provides all Austrian national contact points for the various Horizon 2020 program lines and supports applicants to realize their project ideas at EU level. Also, a few words on my person. I am national contact point for secure societies, where you can expect that ethical issues are very relevant. Within FFG, I'm also coordinating all questions with regard to research ethics, and I'm also involved in the Ethics and Research Integrity Officer Network ERION within the EARMA, the European Association of Research Managers and Administrators, where we discuss how to manage ethical issues and research integrity on university level. So I try again to, Why do we organize a webinar on research ethics and research integrity? Research ethics and research integrity are getting more important. As national contact points, we receive more and more questions on ethical issues. Researchers have to comply with ethical principles, including standards for research integrity. As a researcher, you are responsible for the way you conduct your research and innovation activities. It is important that those involved in research and innovation activities have to be protected. Thus, all participants in your research have to be protected from any harm that may occur, and you have to take special care of vulnerable groups. Research and innovation activities may also have a negative impact on society or the environment. Therefore, you should consider any environmental damage, stigmatization of groups, of population, or misuse of research results, or any other thing that may have a negative impact. But, and that is the important issue, research ethics and research integrity will help you to improve your research outcomes. If you consider ethics and research integrity in an early phase, this will help you to improve the impact of your research. So, it is only by getting the ethics right that research excellence can be achieved. Thanks to the European Commission, there are several running projects that deal with research ethics and research integrity. One example of this project is the project New Horizon that is addressing responsible research and innovation in order to support socially desirable and sustainable research and innovation activities. FFG is one of the contributors to this initiative, financed by Horizon 2020. And another project addressing responsible research and innovation and ethics is the project ThisNet. This is a network of national contact points for science with and for society in Horizon 2020. Again, FFG is one of the contributors to this network, and my colleague Michalis Statsanis, who is NCP for this cross-cutting issue, is also present here today and will support us later in the Q&A session. This webinar has been organized in cooperation with these two initiatives. We had a short poll in the registration step, and you can see that the participants' interests are distributed more or less evenly. Thus, 1/3 wants to know more about ethical issues in the proposal phase, 1/3 wants to know more about these issues in the project implementation phase. And finally, 1/3 is familiar with ethical issues but wants to stay up to date. I think our speaker from the European Commission will tackle all those different aspects. And this brings me directly to Luisa, who will now present the ethics appraisal procedure and the relevant requirements that researchers have to fulfill. Thank you. And now Luisa will start with her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeanette. I will now change the screens to Luisa. Please accept my invitation. Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. My name is Luisa Kalokerinou, and I'm a policy officer at the Ethics and Research Integrity sector of DG Research Innovation of the European Commission. And I would like to thank Jeanette and the organizers very much for the invitation to speak in this webinar. It is a pleasure for me to be here. So in my presentation today, sorry, I'm not, okay. So in my presentation today, I will present somehow briefly, as we are pressed with time, the ethics appraisal process and the different steps that it entails. And after that, I will briefly focus on ethics requirements and ethics issues that stem from research that involves human beings, both medical research and research involving social science and humanities. And finally, we will talk about some ethics issues that are specific to research involving personal data. So most of you probably already know that Horizon 2020 is the biggest to date EU research and innovation program, and it makes available almost 80 billion euros of funding over the course of 7 years, so from 2014 until 2020. And in 2021, this will be replaced by the new framework program, Horizon Europe. So Horizon 2020 is implemented mainly through open calls for proposals that are evaluated by independent experts, first of all, based on their scientific merits, but also based on their compliance with ethics principles. In general, for all activities that are funded by the European Union, ethics is an integral part of research from the beginning to the end of research. And in this regard, the ethical compliance is seen as pivotal to achieve real research excellence. So in this regard, the importance of ethical principles are also underlined in the regulation of establishment of Horizon 2020. More specifically, Article 19 prescribes that all the research and innovation activities that are carried under Horizon 2020 shall comply with ethical principles and relevant national, union, and international legislation. This also includes the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union and the European Convention on Human Rights and its supplementary protocol. Here, I would also like to add that besides a legal obligation as imposed by the regulation establishing Horizon 2020, abiding by ethics principles is also a contractual obligation for researchers. So Article 34 of the grant agreement also prescribes that, that researchers need to comply with ethical principles as well as principles of research integrity as they are mentioned in the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. So these ethical principles refer in particular to, among others, the principle of proportionality, the right to privacy, the right to protection of personal data, the right to the physical and mental integrity of a person, the right to non-discrimination, and the need to ensure high levels of human health protection. However, there are 4 specific fields of research that are excluded from funding. So under no circumstances they can receive funds from the European Commission. The first field of such research is research that aims at reproductive human cloning. The second is research that intends to modify the genetic heritage of human beings, which could make such changes heritable, and also research that intends to create human embryos solely for the purpose of research activities, and this also includes the purposes of stem cell procurement. Finally, the framework program cannot finance research activities that may lead to the destruction of human embryos. Here it's also worth remembering that Horizon 2020 has an exclusive focus on civil applications, which means that that research that aims to develop military applications cannot be funded under the current framework program. So in order to assess compliance and ensure the compliance of projects that are funded by the Commission with these ethics principles, the ethics appraisal process is in place. The ethics appraisal process is roughly divided in 3 different parts. The first part starts already at the application phase, where researchers need to fill in the ethics self-assessment, for which I will talk in more detail in a few minutes. The second part is the ethics review that takes place after the application and before the finalization of the grant agreement, so during the evaluation phase, and depending on the severity of the ethics issues that the proposal may raise, may have 1 or 2 steps. So the first step is the ethics pre-screening and screening, and for projects that raise particular ethics issues, there's also a second step that it's called an ethics assessment, and I will talk about this a bit more in a few minutes. For a limited number of projects that raise serious and complex ethics issues, there's also a third layer of scrutiny that is added after the signature of the grant agreement, so during the lifetime of the project. This is called ethics checks, and it's also performed by independent ethics experts. So in this context, the ethics issues that are examined are broadly divided in 11 categories. This includes issues that are particular to research that involves human embryos and human embryonic stem cells, research involving human being, human cells and tissues, personal data, animals, research involving non-EU countries, research raising issues related to environment, health and safety, dual use, exclusive focus on civil applications, and misuse. In addition, there's an 11th category that allows both applicants and researchers and ethics experts to identify other ethics issues that they do not fall under any of the previous categories. So as I mentioned before, the first step of this process is done by the researchers themselves, and it's the ethics self-assessment. So when researchers fill in their proposal, they need to fill in the ethics table, which is in part A. So for every one of the categories that I listed before, there's specific questions that aim to guide and help researchers identify the particular ethics issues that may be relevant to the research. So, for example, if a researcher is performing research involving human embryonic stem cells, there will be particular questions. For example, are they previously established cell lines? In addition, there's further guidance provided to researchers with regards to what kind of information they need to provide based on the ethics issues that are relevant to their application, and also what kind of documentation they need to obtain. So if researchers flag any ethics issues by saying yes to any of the questions, then they need to go back, they need to go to part B of the application, explain what the ethics issues are, how they will be addressed, and demonstrate how the compliance with ethical and legal standards will be safeguarded. In addition, they need to provide appropriate details on the documentation that needs to be obtained. So, for example, if researchers need to obtain specific ethics approvals or other types of authorizations from relevant authorities. So, after the application is submitted, it goes first through scientific evaluation. If the proposal reaches the threshold during scientific evaluation and is considered for funding, in case researchers have not indicated any ethics issues relevant to their research, their proposal will go through a pre-screening. The pre-screening is usually performed either by independent ethics experts or by qualified commission personnel, and the sole purpose of this is to check whether indeed there is any ethics issues or not. So they don't really assess compliance, they just check whether all the ethics issues have been identified or not. If indeed there are no ethics issues in a proposal, then this proposal will receive an ethics clearance and the grant agreement can be signed. However, if some ethics issues are flagged either during the pre-screening phase or by the researchers themselves, the proposal will go through a screening. Screening is performed by 2 independent ethics experts that they check whether all issues have been correctly identified and appropriately addressed. If this is the case, the proposal can receive a clearance and again, the grant agreement can be signed. However, and this is more or less the majority of cases, if the ethics issues have been partially addressed, so for example, researchers conduct research with human beings, however, they have not really elaborated on how they will recruit human beings, so more details are needed, or an ethics approval is needed to be submitted at a later stage, then relevant requirements will be implemented. These requirements will become contractual obligations and they will need to be fulfilled by the researchers either before the signature or after, depending on their nature. And in this regard, the proposal receives a conditional ethics clearance. For a limited number of projects that raise critical ethics issues, so for example, this of course it will be very contextual, but some examples could be invasive research involving children, as well as large processing of sensitive personal data, for example, and other issues that in their context are deemed to be critical, then an extra layer of scrutiny will be imposed. This is an assessment, an ethics assessment that is performed by 5 ethics experts. So screening is performed by 2, the assessment is performed by 5 ethics experts, that they will assess the ethics issues and the compliance demonstrated by the participants, by the applicants. So in the majority of cases, the assessment will impose requirements that they will become contractual obligations and the grant agreement can be signed. However, in very rare cases, the experts will deem that the proposal of the project has fundamental ethics issues that cannot be solved. So, and in this case, they will give a negative ethics opinion and the proposal will be rejected on ethical grounds. Again, this is a very rare cases because in general, our belief is that by imposing requirements and engaging researchers in a dialogue, you can always improve projects, unless of course they have some fundamental issues. So as I mentioned before, there is also, after the singular issues, an ethics check, 1 or more ethics checks actually can be performed also during the lifetime of the project. This is performed by 5 independent ethics experts. It is for projects that they raise particularly difficult and complex issues, or where the ethics requirements need to be checked during the implementation phase, or when the awareness of researchers need to be very unsatisfactory, so they have not really shown evidence of compliance and documentation provided so far is unsatisfactory. So the main purpose of the ethics checks is to ensure that beneficiaries are assisted in dealing with the ethics issues that are raised and to take preventive and corrective measures with regards to ethics compliance. The checks can result in amendment of a grant agreement or in some cases potentially to reduction of the grant or even its termination if the compliance is deemed to be very low and the issues are very serious. So as you can see here, the degree of scrutiny of a project has to go through is in principle proportionate to the number and severity of the ethics issues. And of course, on how well the ethics issues have been addressed already by the beneficiaries in the previous stages. So maybe before I go to the next phase of my presentation, presentation. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what is happening. Sorry, so before we go any further, maybe I can take a few questions.
So anybody who has, for this first presentation, some questions can post them now by writing in the box where you see questions, and send them to us. I don't see so far any questions.
Okay, so in this case, maybe I can proceed, if this is okay, with the next part, so we don't lose time, and then we can address questions both for the procedural part and the next part together. Is that okay?
Yeah, I just checked.
There are a couple of questions, but we can deal them at the end. Yeah.
As you prefer.
Okay.
Okay. So in this case, sorry. Okay, in this case, I will proceed with the next part, which is about particular ethics issues that arise in research that involves human beings. So this section refers to any research that involves work with humans, regardless of its nature or topic. So this can be collection of biological samples, it can be collection of personal data, medical interventions, studies that involve sociological methodologies, and others. So, in principle, protecting the welfare and autonomy of research participants is a main concern in ethics review and for research ethics in general. So, in this regard, when research involves human, irrespective of its nature, in principle, we need to make sure that the participation of humans in research is voluntary, and that the risks are balanced. So in this regard, in principle, we will always ask beneficiaries to ensure that free and informed consent of all participants has been obtained, and also in principle, we would require that an ethics approval from an appropriate institutional or other ethics committee has been obtained. So in medical research, the ethics standards are very well developed. This is, of course, because the stakes here are very high, and due to the physical and very direct harm that this kind of research can occur to participants. So in this regard, this area of research is very heavily regulated, and there are several standards that researchers need to comply with. This includes the Declaration of Helsinki, the Oviedo Convention on Human Rights in Biomedicine, and when applicable, the EU regulation on clinical trials on medicinal products for human use. So some of the main standards that are imposed in this field, as also addressed in the Declaration of Helsinki, include, first of all, that medical research that involves human subjects must conform to generally accepted scientific principles. In addition, such research needs to be conducted by individuals who are appropriately qualified, so they have relevant medical and scientific qualifications. The risks of research should not exceed the benefits. And the medical research is subject to ethical standards. Such standards include respecting the privacy and confidentiality of participants, respecting their right to withdraw, the right to keep participants informed about information that may emerge during the study and can change the risk-benefit evaluation, and monitoring their welfare and ensuring appropriate treatment is provided. As also mentioned already, a very important part is informed consent of participants, and that research protocols are reviewed by an independent committee prior to the initiation of the research activities. So in this regard, when we have research in human beings in the medical field, some of the information and documents that need to be provided by researchers have to do, of course, with providing informed consent forms and information sheets, and also describing the informed consent procedures. obtaining an ethics approval by an appropriate committee, also detailing the recruitment of participants and the inclusion and exclusion criteria. When it comes to research with patients or vulnerable populations, it is always important to explain further what kind of condition or other vulnerability these individuals may have and how their welfare will be ensured in the context of the study. In addition, for certain cases, it is also important to have an incidental findings policy. Incidental findings are defined usually as findings that have a potential health or reproductive importance for participants and are discovered in the course of conducting research, but they go beyond the aims of the study. So, for example, if you're conducting an imaging study and then you realize that one of the participants have a brain tumor, how would you address that? How would you contact them, and how would you transfer this information? So in this regard, for specific kinds of study, there is a need for researchers to put in place in advance an incidental findings policy where they will explain what kind of findings they will report back, what kind of process is in place, and how they respect the rights of participants to know and not to know. So, as I mentioned before, in general, when it comes to ethics in medical research, there has been already a lot of attention, a lot of guidance, and many appropriate ethics committees. Unfortunately, this is much less the case when it comes to ethics in social science and humanities research. This is because, as opposed to medical research, this kind of research may rarely result in physical harm. However, it can still entail very high ethics risk, as this kind of research that is, well, when we're talking about social science and humanities, a very broad discipline. So it can include sociological, anthropological, psychological studies, and a very wide variety of methodological tools, such as interviews, observations, questionnaires, research conducted through social media, and many more. So this kind of research can also entail some risks and ethics that also include potential psychological, social, or economic harm to human participants, issues related to the protection of personal data and privacy, issues related to potential misuse of results that could also lead to discrimination or stigmatization of participants, and sometimes it can also endanger the safety both of participants as well as researchers. In general, there are many different factors that could indicate that such a project may entail heightened ethics risks, and one of these factors is who are the participants. So, for example, special attention may be needed when participants are children or other vulnerable group. This would include, for example, people unable to give informed consent, minorities, marginalized people, migrants, refugees, victims of abuse and violence. Here you have to keep into account that while some groups are always considered to be vulnerable, in many cases, vulnerability may be considered as contextual. So imagine that you're an employee and your employer wants to conduct an energy efficiency study. So for the purposes of this study, you will have sensors installed in your office that they will measure how much electricity you consume, what time you turn on your light, what time you turn on your computer, when do you log off, and all these things. Here the question is that in this kind of relationship between an employer and an employee, do you really have an option to opt out? Are there other alternatives? Is it likely to be for you to have negative implications because of your participation or not in the study? So those things are very contextual and they need to be taken into account in order to always make sure that participation is voluntary. So another factor that may increase the risk of research is relevant to where the research is conducted, so the sites of research. There might be particular risk when research is conducted, for example, in conflict regions or in troubled neighborhoods where the situation can put in danger both researchers and research participants. In addition, researchers may need to be very sensitive of the cultural setting when performing research in non-EU countries and make sure that both the ethical standards of these places as well as the legal standards are respected and all authorization have been obtained. And especially when it comes to low and lower middle income countries, researchers need to be aware of benefit sharing measures and measures to increase capacity building also in these places. In addition, there are particular areas of research that are considered to be particularly sensitive. For example, topics that they have to do with sexual behavior of participants, about illegal or political activities, experience of violence or abuse, mental health, personal issues with relation to their family lives, and other. In this case, researchers need to be aware of the sensitivity of the issues and make sure that they don't induce feelings of humiliation, stress, or potential re-traumatization of participants. For example, in a recent case that we examined, researchers that they were aiming to interview people who have been used as human shields in war zones, they were interested in conducting interviews via Skype. So one of the requirements was, and the questions to the researchers was, how will they make sure that participants are not unduly upset by the interview and they're not re-traumatized? And the answer we received was, unfortunately, that if they saw via Skype that the participants were upset, they would hang up the connection. And here you can probably see that this is not an appropriate way to really deal with such sensitive topics and to protect participants from being re-traumatized and unduly upset. So in addition, a factor that could increase the risk of research is the methodology used, especially with regards to some kinds of methodologies such as deception or covert research that intrinsically are invasive, as sometimes they don't respect informed consent and privacy of individuals. So in this case, we will have particular requirements in place, and researchers need to be aware of the particular issues that arise here. Another risk factor that we will talk about in more details in a few minutes is data processing, especially when it comes to sensitive personal data. And in addition, researchers also need to be aware of the consequence of research, especially if this can lead to misuse of these findings in many ways. So when it comes to this type of research, some of the information that may need to be provided, of course, depending on the particularities of each case, has to do again with inclusion and exclusion criteria, informed consent procedures, ethics approvals, when appropriate, an evaluation of the ethical implications of a chosen methodology, and potentially, if needed, a risk assessment and steps that are taken to minimize this risk. And also, when applicable, an incidental findings policy. Incidental findings in this context is pretty different, actually, than incidental findings in the medical context, as what we mean here is findings that require some kind of action from the part of research in order to protect participants or other parties, such as, for example, disclosure of criminal activity, bullying, abuse, or violence. So those are some of these, some examples actually. And in this case, researchers will need to plan in advance and inform participants about limits of confidentiality, and also be aware of the legal context and their potential obligation to positively report to the police specific findings. So something that I talked a lot about is informed consent, which is the cornerstone of ethical research and is defined as a subject's free and voluntary expression of his or her willingness to participate in research after having been properly informed about all aspects of research. So at the minimum, the information sheet prepared by researchers need to describe the aims, the methodology and duration of the study, the implication of this research, and any risks and benefits or discomfort that might ensue. In addition, it should always explicitly state that participation is voluntary and that anyone that has the right to refuse to participate or withdraw their participation. Other potential information have to do with who is funding the research, what kind of incidental findings are in place, and who is a person they can contact in relation to this study, as well as what will happen to the results. This information needs to be transmitted in lay terms without any pressure of any kind. It should be adapted to the particularities of research participants and situations, and it should be given there should be given an adequate amount of time for participants to make up their mind. And usually this time is deemed to be 24 hours, but this will largely depend also on the nature of research. So I'm not sure if you would like to discuss some issues now or after I finish with the data protection part also of the presentation.
No, I think now we have received some questions. Maybe that's a good opportunity now for the participants to ask questions, and we will maybe start with the questions we have received so far, and I start with one question and you can then answer it. Wait a minute. Mm-hmm. Okay, the first question is, sorry, are there any ethic guidelines for R&D implementing artificial intelligence applications?
So far, there is some guidance by the high-level group on artificial intelligence, and also there are several groups within the Commission that are working on this specific topic. So it is a field that is very well. There are different parts of the Commission working on it, so there are already some guidelines from the high-level group, and you will also have, there will be many more available in the coming months, I think.
Thank you.
The second question is regarding the ethics review slide, and the question is, if the candidate says there is no ethics screening or there is no ethic issues, the proposal receives de facto an ethics clearance, and is there no review if there are indeed no ethical issues, and if not, the candidate might say there are no ethical issues. Yeah.
So as I said before, I will go back to the slide. Proposals that they don't have any ethics issues indicated, they go through pre-screening. The only purpose of pre-screening is to check whether indeed this is true or not. So if any ethics issue is identified during pre-screening, then the proposal will be sent for screening, and then the whole process will be activated. So it's not just the participants, at least in Horizon 2020, that indicate whether there are ethics issues or not. This is actually checked during the pre-screening and screening phase.
Okay, there's another question on, how ethics will be cleared in environment-related projects?
This will be very, so in how to complete your ethics self-assessment, there are specific guidelines on specific issues. So this will be, of course, related to the specific questions. I cannot just say, I mean, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. It will depend on the specific issues that are raised by the project, what kind of authorizations you need, for example, for the labs, for the personnel, what kind of training. So, but if you go to the section on environment, health and safety, again, you will find specific questions. You can see what applies to your project. And you can see for each one of these sections and questions what kind of information you need to provide. At the end of my presentation, which will be made available after this webinar, I also include a link to the how to complete your ethics self-assessment. So by following this, you can see what is applicable to the specificities of your project.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a shorter question. How are evaluators being selected?
So we have an open database where people can register. After they register and they indicate themselves that they're experts in ethics and they have an interest in evaluating ethics projects. Of course, also they upload their CV where they indicate their specific field of expertise. These experts are being trained by the Commission, so we have a 2-day training in order to make sure that everybody understands the process and the specific issues and what are the Commission guidelines for evaluating them. And after the training, participants will be invited by the Commission to evaluate specific projects. And the aim is to always match the specific expertise of the experts with the specific nature of the projects and the ethics issues that are raised.
Okay, there's another longer question. Okay, I tried. How to deal with, for example, psychological damage of respondents after experiments? Does the researcher have any obligation in giving aftercare, for example, psychological help? Do researchers have to pay for this? How to prove that there is consequence of them? And there it stops. I can't see how it continues. Of the experiment. Okay, thank you. Did you get it, Luisa?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. But if I don't respond exactly, please repeat it. So in general, as a researcher, you do have the responsibility to assess what kind of damage may occur to your participants. So if you think that the participation or the specific nature of the project and the questions that will be asked, for example, in an interview study, may traumatize them or harm them in any way, then you have to try to minimize it. And in some cases, it might be appropriate to also, yes, maintain, try to give them aftercare. It will really depend. For me, for example, in the example I gave with human shields, and what we would expect for somebody to do is to, first of all, involve people who have appropriate expertise. They are psychologists, they are psychiatrists, they know how to deal with people who have faced trauma in their life, because of course, if somebody has been a human shield in the past, they have a huge trauma. So you do need somebody who understands that how to deal with this trauma. They can review the questionnaire, they can see what kind of questions may be completely inappropriate, for example, or they can help researchers to deal with questions in a way that is more appropriate and it will not enhance the harm to participants. There could be, for example, a training of researchers in psychological issues, so they can recognize in advance when a participant is getting upset and help them to calm down, or they can, of course, they can provide information or hotlines if needed. But this, again, it's very difficult to give a one-size-fits-all answers because this will be very context-related. Of course, we don't expect researchers to do this for every single interview study. This is clear. But also, we do expect them, if they are touching upon very sensitive issues with very vulnerable population, they really need to make sure that they understand what is at stake and that they do have the appropriate expertise that is required here for them to assess the risk and minimize it. So did I respond?
Yes, you did. I think there was one part asking, yeah, does the researcher have to pay for this? I mean, if anything happens, is he responsible and does he have to pay?
Researchers are always responsible. I'm not sure. Pay for what?
Yeah, but the aftercare, for example, because sometimes in some countries, psychological support is not paid by the health insurance, and then maybe the researchers has to pay.
So yes, researchers, if they decide to to take this specific solution, again, there are different ways. I'm not saying that they have to hire psychologists. They can include like somebody in the research team that has this expertise. It really depends. But in case they need to hire, for example, external experts to help them, then this can be included in the way they will use the budget of the project. But please be reminded that researchers are always responsible for keeping up with ethics standards and for the implications of the research.
Thank you.
I will take up a related question. What are counted as appropriate institutional approvals or ethics committee that can approve the research? Can it be a self-organized ethics committee within a department or research center, or does it require external auditing?
So normally what we consider an institutional approval is that, well, the ethics approval given by the ethics committee of the university. So you don't need if you already have an established ethics committee in your institution, well, university or not, it doesn't matter. If you have an ethics committee that is recognized within your institution, then this is an appropriate ethics approval. In cases where institutions do not have this, then they can either try to find another appropriate ethics committee from another partner of the consortium, for example, or they can see if there is a regional or national body in some cases, although this is not very often the case. But if they cannot find any kind of appropriate ethics committee, then they have to deal with these issues themselves. And if it's a complex project, then it is always recommended that they hire, that they establish an ethics board that will monitor the project and the ethics issues that arise in this context.
Okay, then there's another question referring to the self-assessment, I think, regarding the ethics review slide. If the candidate says there's no ethics screening, the proposal receives the de facto ethics clearance, ? Is there no review if there are indeed no ethical issues? If not, the candidate might say there are no ethic issues as to avoid the more burdensome procedure if you say there are ethic issues.
Okay, I think I responded to that already partly. So again, when the researcher says that there are no ethics issues, then the proposal goes through a pre-screening, which means that people specifically checked whether this is true or not. And in the screening, as you can see now in the slide, and I mentioned before, so if there are ethics issues and are identified, the proposal is sent through screening. If everything has been, there are ethics issues, but they're all recognized, they're all dealt with properly, and there's nothing more to be done at this stage, then we have an ethics clearance. However, in most cases, there's always something that needs to be done further. There are some issues that have not been identified. There are some issues that have been identified, but they have not been properly addressed. And in this case, you will have ethics requirements that will need to be implemented. And these will be contractual obligations that they need to be fulfilled, some of them before even the grant agreement is signed, some others during the lifetime of the project. And if these requirements, they need to be fulfilled later and they're not, then this means that beneficiaries fail to comply with their contractual obligations and their grant can be reduced or cancelled. Is this clear?
Yes.
Yeah. We have another question regarding research with humans. What happens if the informant does not like his statement after the results of research is published? The info obtained from the informant not necessarily risks his or her life, but the person just denies and wants to be removed after the research is out. What does the ethics say about this situation?
I'm sorry, can you repeat? Because I don't think I... Could you repeat the question?
It says, what happens if the informant... Can you hear me, Luisa?
Yes, I can. Yes.
What happens if the informant does not like his statement after the results of research is published? The info obtained from the informant does not necessarily risk her life, but the person just denies and wants to be removed after the research is out. What does the ethics say about this situation?
So in general, well, participants have the right to withdraw, of course. After publication, this is very difficult. However, this can be in advance dealt with an informed consent form, where you inform people about how you will report findings, what is the purpose of research, so they are not taken aback by the final result. So, and also it is largely a matter of research integrity, how you would report the findings and how close you stay to the quotes, for example. But in principle, researchers do have a right to withdraw. However, after publications, this would be very, very difficult. I think that, again, it will really depend on the specifics, on whether research participants had been informed in advance, what kind of research this is, if there is a possibility for a correction of the manuscript afterwards, for example. But I would consider that this would happen in very extreme cases where the issues are very sensitive and research participants were not really adequately involved about what their participation entails.
Okay, I think there are many questions right now. Maybe I will just ask one question from the audience and then we start with the next presentation, because I saw that some questions are with regard to data protection, but I saw one on SSH specifically, and that's missing now. Michalis, do you see this? There was one question with regard to SSH. I don't see it now.
Yeah. There are a couple actually. I'm reading out this one that mentions SSH. How to document ethics approval in SSH research in the preparatory process. If ethics approvals by independent body is not mandatory under national legislation in certain research areas.
So this really depends. So in many institutions, and now these institutions are becoming more and more, there are specific institutional ethics committees that either are specific to social science and humanities, or there are research ethics committees that they also provide approvals for this type of research. So of course, if we have this kind of committee, then the answer is easy, because you just get an ethics approval from this specific kind of committee. However, if you don't have this kind of committee and you cannot find an appropriate committee, and this is not necessary under your national legislation, then you need to very clearly state this, that currently this is not an obligation you have, you don't have the opportunity to do it because of lack of specific ethics committees, and then you really need to detail very clearly how the ethics issues are dealt within the project, because again, it doesn't matter if you have an ethics approval or not. The responsibility of conducting ethical research is always with the researcher. So in either way, the ethical conduct of research needs to be ensured and demonstrated. And also in this case, if, for example, you feel that even though you cannot obtain an ethics approval, but you need more guidance, it is always advisable to have guidance from an ethics advisor who has specific expertise in this particular ethics issues.
Okay, then one last question on SSH research. I am conducting social science research in 2 non-EU countries, but my institution is an EU country. Do I need to find partner institutions in these other non-EU countries to receive ethical clearance to conduct my research? And now it's gone.
In addition to receiving clearance from the ethics boards at my own institution.
So
Thank you.
it is always, well, first of all, you have to make sure what is the legal, you have to know what is the legal environment in the countries where you conduct research and whether there are specific authorizations that are needed in these specific contexts. In general, it is always a good practice if you can find a committee, especially when it comes to low and lower middle income countries. It is always advisable to find an appropriate institutions that can give an ethics approval in order to ensure that also the ethical standards in this third country is also are also being upheld, and we don't end up and there's no risk of ethics dumping. Of course, in some cases this is not possible, so it is not possible to find an ethics committee in this particular country. And in this case, so if it is not possible to find an ethics committee in this country, and this is not required by legislation, by law in this third country, then it is enough that the appropriate approval that you have from your institution covers all sites and parts of research.
Okay, I would say we keep the other questions for the next Q&A session, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the data protection
yes.
part.
So we're already a bit, short of time, but I will try to be very fast with this. So data protection is a field, well, ethics issues related to data protection have received a lot of attention lately. And here I would really like to emphasize that the aim of the ethics review in this field is not to implement the GDPR, but to assess the ethics risks that they stem from relevant research activities. So as personal data, we consider any information that relate to an identified or identifiable person, such as the name of a person, location data, IP address, social security number, or any other data that can directly or indirectly identify an individual. In general, like with everything else, in data protection, we have a risk-based approach. So, for example, imagine that you have a workshop of experts because you want to produce guidelines on a topic. So this is the aim of the project. So you conduct a workshop with experts, you collect their names, their emails, and that's it. So this is one project. And then on the other hand, you have a project that conducts that processes genetic data on a large scale in order to study mental illness. So those are very different issues you have here. So clearly, in both cases, you have data processing, personal data processing, and both projects need to comply with the GDPR. However, in the first case, where you only have names and emails of experts in the course of their professional activities, it is very unlikely that you will also have ethics issues related to it. In the second case, you can imagine that there may be several ethics issues related to it. For example, return of results, incidental findings, potential even discrimination of people. So it will really depend on the risks of each project. So in order to determine whether a project and data processing is of high risk, again, there are several indicators. The first has to do with what kind of personal data are being processed, because of course some data are more sensitive than others. And this kind of sensitive data include information on racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious beliefs, genetic, biometric, or health data, data on sexual lifestyle, trade union membership. In addition, it is important to consider who is your data subject that is involved in this study. And particular attention need to be paid when it comes to children, for example, because in general they tend to be less aware about the implications of their activities. Vulnerable people and people who have not given their explicit consent in order to participate in a project. In addition, risk may be raised by the scale and complexity of data processing. So if you're processing data at a very large scale, if you're systematically monitoring publicly accessible areas, or involve multiple data sets and big data in your research, it is also likely that the risk will raise. In addition, the risk can be dependent on the data collection or data processing techniques that are involved. So it depends on how privacy invasive are the methodologies. So when you're using tracking or surveillance of participants, or when you're deceiving them in order to get their data, this will be considered as an indicator of high risk. The aim is with the use of cameras in order to constantly monitor the behavior of the individual when you're mining data through data crawling on social networks and when you're profiling individuals on groups. For example, imagine a project that aims to determine which factors may lead to radicalization of individuals. And for this purpose, you go through social media of people, through the dark web, you combine information, different kind of information, and you're trying to predict whether individuals may be radicalized or not. Here you can imagine that besides the potential benefits of such a project, it can also have very serious risk. It can risk having false positives on specific individuals, and it can even have very tangible negative implications for the individuals and even entire communities in case this leads to discrimination and stigmatization. In addition, another factor that may increase the risk of data processing is the involvement of non-EU countries. So this happens when the personal data are transferred outside the European Union, and this is because right now very few non-EU countries are covered by the adequacy decision of the European Commission that indicates that the level of data protection offered is equivalent to that within the EU. So this means that participants may not be adequately protected, and for this reason, the researchers need to ensure that the ethics standards are upheld no matter where the research takes place, and of course that the transfer of data is according to Chapter 5 of the GDPR on data transfers. In addition, there might be some issues regarding collection of personal data outside the EU and then transferring them within the EU. And this happens especially in countries where they have so-called data sovereignty laws, which means that some countries, they have limitations of what kind of data you can export from a country. So, for example, maybe in one country, it is not permitted to export information related to political beliefs of their citizens, or health information, or other types of data. So this really will be content related and specific to laws of specific countries. So in case of high risk data processing, researchers must provide a detailed analysis of the ethics issues that are raised, and they have to have an overview of all data collection and processing operations and identification and analysis of the ethics issues that are raised. And in addition, they really need to explain how these ethics issues will be mitigated in practice. So in order to mitigate these concerns, researchers need to put, or they have the option to put several measures in place. First of all, consent is the main pillar for ensuring fairness of data processing. So whenever it is possible to obtain informed consent from people, this is always advisable from an ethics perspective. In addition, many institutions are required to appoint a data protection officer, and the DPO plays a key role in ensuring compliance and safeguarding the rights of research participants. In this case, and especially when it comes to high-risk data processing, it is always advisable that the DPO has an active role in advising and guiding researchers in dealing with the ethics issues that arise. And also researchers seek their advice in order to ensure that data processing is legal, fair, and transparent. In addition, it is good for researchers to be reminded that for specific types of data, so for health, genetic, and biometric data, member states can introduce derogations. So this means that for specific member states can introduce, and many of them have already done this, have introduced national laws that raise the standards of processing for these specific categories of data. So researchers need to know that besides the GDPR, which of course always applies, in the case of derogations, they also be mindful and respectful of their national legislation. An important principle to ensure the legal and ethical data processing is the data minimization principle. This means that the data collected need to be strictly limited to what is necessary for the purposes of research. A good example of how easy it is not to abide to this data minimization principle is informed consent forms. So of course it will depend on the type of research you conduct, but normally in an informed consent form you will need the name of the individual and maybe an email or a telephone number in case you need to contact them again. Usually you don't even need their address. In a conference I was recently, in the informed consent form for the release of my slides, I was asked, besides my name and my affiliation, date of birth, country of nationality, passport number, marital status, and many other information that had nothing to do with the purposes of the initial processing. So you can see that, and as researchers, of course, sometimes it is very easy, I mean, I also understand it, I have been a researcher myself, that it is nice to gather as many information as you feel that is interesting. However, if they're not directly related to the purposes of your research, you shouldn't be doing that, and you should be conscious of the limitations that are provided by the GDPR. In addition, one of the most effective ways to mitigate ethics concern is to anonymize data so they no longer relate to identified or identifiable person. This is the case, for example, with aggregate and statistical data or data that are rendered otherwise anonymous in an irreversible way. So here we also have to be mindful that due to technical measures that are currently available, anonymization is rather challenging, and re-identification of data can happen sometimes. So researchers need to evaluate whether anonymization is possible, and if they're not sure, they need to err on the side of caution and treat their data as personal. So in case anonymization is not possible due to the purposes of research, then researchers are asked to pseudonymize data, which means that they need to, for example, replace a direct identifier such as a name with an indirect identifier like a number, while still keeping the key, so the correspondence of names with these numbers. And this can happen if based on the purposes of the project, anonymized data cannot be used. And only when anonymization and pseudonymization is not possible, then researchers can use readily personal data. So in addition, researchers have both an ethical and a legal obligation to make sure that stringent data security measures are in place that are also commensurate to the risks posed to the data subject from the specific research activities. In some cases, it might be sufficient to have, for example, a password. In other cases, you will also need to encrypt the data, or even when the risk is very high, you will need to also take extra measures. For example, in a recent project that examined, that involved processing of mental health data from people in a particular non-EU country, it was considered to be very high risk because in this particular country, mental health patients were considered to be lesser humans, basically. So disclosure of this data was considered to be extremely dangerous, both for the participants and their families. And for this reason, the researchers propose that they don't keep anything on site in this country, and they encrypt all data and they directly transfer them in the country where they were based, and that was deemed to be very appropriate under the particular circumstances. So finally, researchers need to evaluate the ethics risks when those are deemed high, and when appropriate, they also need to conduct a data protection impact assessment according to Article 35 of the GDPR. So in general, we have to keep in mind that it is very important to consider the actual ethics risks that may be involved in data processing. as data are not just numbers. There are people behind it, and sometimes it's very easy to forget, especially when we're, for example, mining personal data through social media where we never see those actual people. But this ethics risk that can be involved in disclosing personal data or not affording them the appropriate protection involve discrimination of participants, stigmatization, exposing their identity, potential security and safety risks, as I mentioned, reputational risk, harms to the interest and well-being of the participants, and potential misuse of data for other purposes. So as I mentioned before, I will make available my slides where you can find, first of all, the email to our functional mailbox where you can address all the questions that we don't have time to discuss today. And you can find further guidance on how to complete your ethics self-assessment and all the specific ethics issues you may encounter, and more information on social science and humanities in our relevant guideline and set of guidelines, and the same about ethics and data protection. I have included all the links to all the guidelines in this slide, so I hope you will find them useful. And thank you very much. And I know we are already out of time, but if you're still there, we can already address some more questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luisa, for spending this much time in presentation and also in answering the questions. Yes, we have many questions. I don't think we will address every question, but let's see. I will now start with the next question that is still open, and that is, are there any restrictions on the secondary use of animal data? For example, data produced outside of the EU in research that could not take place within the EU.
So we're talking about animal data, is it?
Yeah.
Did I hear correctly? So not personal data, animal data.
Animal data, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so with regards to secondary use of animal data, here what we would expect is proof that these data were obtained in an ethical way. So researchers need to basically detail where they found the data from and what was the previous study that collected them, and how the previous study abided by the specific standards. So in principle, again, it is very hard to give very specific guidance without knowing the specifics of a project. But in principle, here what we would require is evidence that those data were acquired in an ethical way.
Okay, thank you.
The next question is regarding working with humans, human beings again. It says, our research rests on data collection through an ethnographic that includes participant observations in refugee camps and before courts. Do we have to distribute informed consent sheets in such situations? And I combine it with another question. Does the informed consent always need to be recorded in written or video audio form, or is verbal and non-recorded informed consent acceptable under the ethics guidelines? So there are two questions.
Yes, I mean, in principle, yes, you have to obtain informed consent of all participants. I'm not sure exactly how you can, if it is possible to distribute it, if it's possible to have like one main contact point that from the camp, with regards to the first question, that they will inform all the people living in the camp. However, it is important to make clear that because again, we're talking about very vulnerable populations, that they need to have a meaningful way of refusing to participate in this study if they don't want to. So here you have to be very mindful of this fact, and you have to make sure that the informed consent is written in a way that is understandable and appropriate for the situation. That, for example, if you need to involve particular NGOs in distributing or writing the informed consent in order to make sure that it's appropriate for the sensitivities of the area, this might or might not be appropriate, but it really depends on your study. And then, yes, you need to make sure that all all people who are participating in your research know that they are research participants, and they are given the possibility of declining. And the second question was about recorded informed consent. So in principle, yes, you will need to record the informed consent in some way. Normally, the informed consent is signed. In some cases, you can also record it or document it in another way. However, here it's also important to acknowledge that informed consent is not an end in itself. So basically, we don't just want to see a signature. In some cases, the informed consent may, for example, like documenting informed consent may even put participants in danger. So for example, yes, if you're taking interviews with dissidents of an oppressive regime in this country, then writing their name down in any way or recording it might put them in danger. So in this way, you just have to find a way of detailing how you took informed consent from people, what kind of information were communicated, and that they have all been informed and agreed to participate. Those are very exceptional cases. So in principle, yes, we would ask for a documented informed consent. However, in very exceptional circumstances, alternatives can also be acceptable. However, it's very important that researchers explain what are the particular circumstances, why it is not deemed to be in the benefit of participants to document informed consent, and alternatively how they will prove that they have provided all this appropriate information by just documenting the information that they provide to participants.
Okay, we have another question dealing with informed consent. It's a question about the withdrawal of consent after publication, and the question is, don't the results always have to be anonymized before being published?
Sorry, because I understand these are two different questions, or it's the same question?
So no, it's the same question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in general, yes. I mean, it will depend on the study, because in specific sociological studies, maybe if you say in advance to participants that, for example, you're doing an elite study with specific individuals from specific institutions, they all agree to disclose their affiliation and they're fine with it. So in exceptional circumstances, if this does not cause any ethics risks and participants have given their informed consent, I can imagine that this could be acceptable, not having completely anonymized data. However, in the majority of cases, yes, indeed, research data will be anonymized. And of course, if they have actually been anonymized, then you cannot withdraw data anymore, because you cannot go back and find the data of particular individuals. And this is fine as long as indeed data are actually anonymized and you cannot really go back to them.
The next question has again to do with GDPR and data protection. It says all of these advices, and it's an early question, so it was also relating to research on human beings. All of these advices are related to GDPR. What about when you want to share data with countries outside the EU? And what about when you have data but not a consent, say, for example, registered data? Do you have any guidelines for that?
Yes, you can find more guidance in our guidance note on ethics and data protection, which again, I will give you the link to. I think that I already mentioned, but the data transfers need to comply, of course, with Chapter 5 of the GDPR. And also, you have to keep in mind that according to the regulation established in Horizon 2020, ethics standards need to be the same no matter where research takes place. So even if it takes place outside the EU, the same ethics standards apply as within the EU. And this is very important to be reminded of. With regards to secondary use of data, in cases where consent is not possible, what a researcher need to provide is the authorization from the controller of the data set. and also an explanation on the legal basis that they are using, and how and demonstrate how the processing is fair and transparent, and also, of course, lawful. But you can also find more information, more details about it in an explicit separate section on secondary use of personal data that we have in this particular set of guidelines.
Okay, thank you so much so far. We are already nearly half an hour past our originally foreseen time. Do you still have time to answer questions, or should we stop here maybe?
If it's possible, I can take 1 or 2 more questions, and then again, everybody's very welcome to send more questions in the help desk, and my team and I will respond to those as well. Okay,
then we have again some questions with regard to GDPR. It seems to be very specific, this one. I will read it.
If they're very specific, maybe it's better to go through the
guideline,
through the help desk.
Yeah. Okay.
Because also I think that it's better to read more general questions that are also of interest to other participants, if it's possible.
Then I will read. Sorry, an easy and general question. Do organizations have to nominate a data protection officer?
There are specific types of organizations that need to do that, not all of them, and there are specific requirements on the GDPR. So if you're not sure, I would really suggest to check on the GDPR if the specific requirements apply to your organization. In principle, most research performing organizations like universities, they do. But it will really depend on whether they fall within the scope of the specific article or not. So this is a very black and white legal questions that you need to check with your legal expert.
Okay, and then maybe one last question with regard to collection of personal data outside the EU. What if the servers where the data is stored lies within the EU, but the final owner, the mother company, is from outside the EU?
What is the question?
Sorry. Collection of it refers to the collection of personal data outside the EU. What happens if the server lies within the EU, where the data is stored, but the owner of the data of the server, maybe it's not specified here, lies outside the EU?
So the question is, who is the processor, or
might be
if
there is a problem with having a server which lies in the EU, but the mother company of the server.
There is no problem, because if the data are stored in the EU, then they're processed in the EU, so the GDPR applies regardless. Yeah. Of course, if they're collected in a third country, the relevant laws apply as well. And as I said before, it doesn't really matter where you are with regards to ethics standards, because they have to be implemented regardless where researchers are. So, yeah. Was that, did this answer the question?
Yeah, I think it's the answer to the question. And there's maybe one last question, and then I think we have it. Can I accept pseudonymized neuro data processed in a non-EU country without privacy adequacy?
So the question is if pseudonymized, so personal data can be imported from a non-EU country to the EU. So the answer to this is that unless there is, first of all, in principle, yes, unless there is a specific law in this country preventing the export of such data from the country. But in general, here you also have to be mindful what I said about in the question about the secondary use of animal data, that you have to ensure that these data were acquired in an ethical way, because this may be a question that you will have during the ethics review. If for example, those data were conducted in the context of a research study in an institution outside the EU, even if it doesn't have adequacy, if you can basically prove that all approvals were obtained in order to perform this research, and the data are legally exported, then I don't see any ethics issues in using them further to perform research in Europe.
Okay, thank you. That was really great, and I think we managed to answer nearly all questions posed by our tool. So I also thank Michalis for helping, and I think Abigail will now take over and stop the presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Jeanette, for your presentations. Thank you, Michalis, for helping with the Q&A session. And thank you to all participants for your interesting questions. We now will come to an end. We have overdrawn half an hour. Thank you for those who stuck around and sent in questions. In order to improve our webinars, it is important for us to know if the content was useful for you. So for this reason, please answer the feedback questions directly after the webinar. Yes, that's all from me. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at one of our next webinars. Goodbye and have a nice afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.